In this lecture, we will continue our discussion on repetition structures.
We'll first look at what we call pretest and post-test loops. A pretest loop is a loop. It's just that we test the condition before we go into the loop. So we check, is the condition true or false, depending on what type of loop it is. Then we'll go into the body of the loop. We've already seen loops like this. For example, both the do while loop and the do until loop are considered pretest loops, because in both cases we test the condition first, and then depending on what type of loop it is, then we'll go into the body of the loop. Now a post-test loop is a little different. Here we test the condition after we run the body of the loop once. This is similar to how do-while loops work in other languages like in Java, C, or C++. So let me give you a couple of examples here using our do-while loops and do-until loops in Visual Basic. So here is a do-while loop in the post-test format. So we would execute the statements first. So we have the word do, and then we go into the body and do whatever statements we have. Then we have loop while, and then the condition. So here, if the condition is true, we'll go back into our loop and repeat the instructions. But the key thing here is that we do execute the statements at least once. And then here is an example of the do until loop set up as a post-test loop. So we still have the word do. We have our set of statements that we're going to run. So we run those statements at least once. Then we have loop, until, and then our condition. So here, if the condition is false, we'll go back and repeat the statements. So notice that really the only difference is where we put the while condition or the until condition. So instead of having it come after the word do, we put it at the bottom and put it after the word loop. Here's an example of some code where we have a do-while loop set up as a post-test loop. This is the same example as we did in the last lecture. So we have a counter that's an integer. It's initially 1, and then inside the body of our loop, we're going to display the value of the counter and increment it by 1. And we see here that our condition is down at the bottom, so it's down here. And we have the word while down here as well. So we're going to repeat these instructions as long as the condition is true. So let's just walk through this to make sure we see what's going on. So counter is initially 1. We execute the loop at least once because we have the word do up here. We have our message box. We display 1. So we'll display 1. I'll put it right here. There, we displayed 1. We'll increment our counter by 1. So now counter is 2. We go down to our condition. Counter is less than or equal to 3 because counter is 2. So it's true. So we'll go back into our loop. We'll display the value of counter. So it's going to be 2. And then we increment it. So counter is now 3. 3 is less than or equal to 3. So since our condition is true, we'll go back and we'll display our counter again, which is 3. And then we increment our counter by 1. So that's going to be 4. 4 is not less than or equal to 3. So we would say that our condition is false, and we would exit the loop. Here's a flowchart to help illustrate a post-test loop, at least the example that we just did. So we have our beginning line here where counter is initially 1. And notice that we don't go to our question just yet. We immediately go to print our counter, and then we'll increment our counter by 1, and then we'll go back up to the question. So that's the idea of this post-test loop. We run the statements at least once. So here we run the print counter and increment the counter statements once, and then we'll check the value of counter to see if it's less than or equal to 3. If so, then we'll go back to print our counter and then just repeat this all over again. And then finally, when our condition becomes false, we'll get out. So the only difference between this flowchart and what we've seen before is just that our initial statement goes right to the yes portion. So you can kind of think of it as just assuming it's automatically true from the get-go before we go back to our condition. Here's a code example of the exact same thing as before. The only difference now is we're using the do until loop because we have the word until down here. So counter is 1. We're going to execute the lines of code inside the body right here. And we keep repeating that as long as our condition down here is false. So we would come down here, we would print 1, increment it to 2. 2 is not greater than or equal to 3, so that's false. So we'll go back up, and we just keep repeating this until our condition becomes true, and then when that happens, we get out. So once again, the whole difference here is we execute the body of this loop at least once. Exclamation point for emphasis. Here's a flowchart to illustrate the do until loop in the post-test format. We'll see it's exactly the same as the flowchart for the do while loop. The only difference is we just switch the yes and no. So no is over here and yes is over here. Everything else is the same. We start up here where our condition or our counter is initially 1. We'll execute all the statements at least once, and then we'll go into our condition if it's false, and then we'll repeat all these statements, and we'll keep cycling through this until our condition is true, which then we will get out of the whole loop and just resume the rest of our code.